This is George Gruhn for our Friday question and answer session. I'd like to start by reminding folks that while we're on Zoom, it is also simultaneously on Facebook, and later in the day will also be archived not only on Facebook but on YouTube. So for those who might come in the middle of the presentation or think that they're missing something, all of these are archived and available. So much for that. I'd like to start with a little bit of show and tell time with a couple of interesting DeQuisto guitars, a pair. The first one, right here, is a 15-inch wide arch top, arched back, hand carved, 6-string oval hole, and it is in the records as having been a special oval hole made for Melanie. And this is one that is available here now. Certainly it's a rare enough, I believe, to be one of a kind. Jimmy DeQuisto was, of course, the apprentice for D'Angelico and went on to become known as one of the finest archtop guitar builders in the entire history of the instrument. And certainly his are very desirable. His most known disciple these days is possibly John Monteleone, and Monteleone's instruments start new at $50,000 and go up from there. DeQuisto, when he started out, was making instruments for about $1,200. After D'Angelico died in '64, DeQuisto took over the shop and finished out a few that D'Angelico and he had started, and then he went on his own. But by his death in 1995, his reputation had grown to the point where he was getting in excess of $30,000 for a new instrument, and sometimes as high as 50. This one is serial number 1061. It's hand signed inside and dated 10/26/72, and is available right now from us at $30,000. Another one I just picked up yesterday. This is a 12-string, which, as you note, looks quite similar to the other one and is only a few months later. This is one that we had quite a few years ago and have back now because the owner who purchased it from us died recently, and it is back with us. But this also is probably one of a kind. I don't see any other notation for a 12-string oval hole arch top in the ledger for DeQuisto, but you'll note a great deal of similarity in these two guitars. This one is serial number 1071. It was listed in the ledger for DeQuisto as a special 12-string, and it was made for Sal Di Troia. Most of DeQuisto's customers were professional musicians. And at any rate, this one just came in yesterday and will soon be posted on our website. And it is also priced at $30,000. We had a question regarding the differences between the patent applied for and later humbucking pickups. And for that question, while I have some familiarity, there are people on my staff who know more than I do. So I'd like to bring Corey, who answered a question previously about amplifiers, in a previous session. He's very familiar with the humbucking pickups, and he can give you a brief presentation. We have more information than we can easily do in a brief presentation today. So if people want more, if you would send me an email, george@guitars.com. That is my personal email address, which I pay attention to rigorously and answer all questions that come in. You can get more information, but Corey is very well able to give you a good synopsis of what is so special about the PAFs versus some others and the basic evolution of Gibson humbucking pickups over the years. And here is Corey.
Thank you, George. Okay, well, PAF pickups, humbucking pickups in general, that's a big conversation, big long conversation. But there are very specific differences in the evolution of, let's say, Gibson's humbucking pickup. Notice I say Gibson's humbucking pickup and not humbucking pickups in general, because you know there's original patents for humbucking style pickups that date back to the 30s. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the evolution of, let's say, the patent applied for, or the PAF pickups. Essentially, they were invented, or the pen went to paper in 1955 with Seth Lover, who worked for Gibson. People might know the Seth Lover name, but they don't know where they know that from, and it's very possible that in a modern setting, people understand that Seymour Duncan, the pickup manufacturer, worked with Seth Lover for quite a while and have a patent applied for style pickup that they produce, which is meant to reproduce vintage styled sounds. Excellent pickup, by the way, for a modern pickup. But then by late 56, they went into production and they came up with what we know as the humbucker pickup, or two single coils that are opposite wired and basically work kind of against each other, but suppressing a 60 cycle hum, which a single coil pickups essentially, it's a well-designed pickup, but it also acts like an antenna. So any extraneous noises in the room, anything that you're plugged into that outlet, your amp is in that, and you're basically an antenna for noise. So the humbucking pickup bucks the hum. That's what it's named for. And so around 62, they replaced it with what they call patent number pickups. Slightly different. And also within the eras of the PAFs, the patent numbers, and then obviously it went into the T-top pickups, went from 67 era to about 75. The T-tops were called T-tops, or referred to as T-tops, because of the markings left on top of the plastic from the tooling and the machinery. Basically in between those, it's about magnet size and magnet strength. What kind of magnets are we using? From 56 to 60, they used Alnico 2s, Alnico 3s, Alnico 4s and 5s. When I say Alnico, I'm saying it's a combination of aluminum, nickel, and cobalt. So you mix those words together and you get the acronym Alnico. Wow, if we're not confused by now, right? Anyway, from 61 to 75, they pretty much decided that the Alnico 5 pickup was going to be the strongest, and it was going to be kind of the standard that they were going to use. The original magnet was 2.5 inches long, but they did shorten it to I think it was by 61, they shortened it to 2 1/4. And although you can get that shortened bar magnet, if it was an Alnico 5 magnet, it still had that strength. It was the more powerful of the magnets. Wires eventually changed. The coil wires that they wrapped everything with, as well as the lead wires, that changes your overall tone. And I think what we're really looking for is, you know, what kind of output are we getting here? The early ones, so let's say from late 56 to 61, late 61, you're getting about 7.5 to 9.5 K ohms. That would be kind of what people think of when they think of one of the bursts. 61 to 65, you're down to about 7.25 to about maybe 7.75. And then it went down to 65 to 75, let's say. You know, with the T-tops, you're looking at probably about 7.5. And so that's how I see things. When I think of pickups, I'm thinking of kind of era, not necessarily the PAFs, because all of those pickups from that time frame that I gave you, from let's say late 56 to 75, they're all really great sounding. It depends on what it's in. It depends on how you play, what kind of amp. There's a lot of variables. I definitely welcome any and all questions. Email, you can email me. Again, I'm Corey, C-O-R-E-Y, @guitars.com. And you know, it might be a long email that you get back from me, depending on how specific you know, an answer that you need. But if you do need a very specific answer, and it's something I didn't touch on, or something that didn't, you know, make the light bulb go off right now, and you go, ah, oh, yeah, I get it. Feel free to reach out to me. Again, Corey @guitars.com. And I thank you for the opportunity to do a little explaining today. I'm going to get you back with George.
Okay. I have said on numerous occasions that we have a great team here, and that while I do claim that I know quite a bit, I don't claim to know everything. And one of the things that makes Gruhn Guitars special is that it is not a one-man show. I have members of the staff who in certain specific areas do know more than I do. And I am stronger for having a team. This is not a one-man operation. And one person on that team who works closely with me on appraisals and is a real expert on vintage Gibson history, Joe Spann, who wrote a book, Spann's Guide to Gibson, 1902 through 1941, but knows a lot more than just that period, has access to an enormous number of Gibson records that he has studied for many years, has compiled a great book of information. We would like to have him right now discuss Lloyd Lohr, Gibson's great acoustic engineer of note, or at least that's what he's noted to be, but perhaps there's more to it than what is commonly noted, because while he signed the labels of the Style 5 master model instruments from 1922 through December of 24, many people think that that means that he personally played each and every one and proved them. Seems like that from the label. Or that he personally designed everything about it, or even sat there and made them. And there's more to it than that. He was involved with the marketing and possibly some aspects of design on banjos and the mandolins. But again, I'd like to introduce Joe Spann, who works with me on appraisals and research, and who I consider to be one of the most knowledgeable people ever on Gibson history. And there are certain things that I can learn by looking at instruments, but there are other things that can only be learned by spending years of meticulous research going through historical records, written records. Sometimes written records tell you things that you cannot tell with your eyeballs, like what day did it leave the factory? Where did it go from there? Did it come back for repair? Or was it sold multiple times because they had loan out programs during the Depression, and the dealer could send it back if it didn't sell and then trade it for something else and it would go to another dealer. Well, you can't tell that by looking at it. Joe has great knowledge from looking at instruments, but also tremendous knowledge that he has brought to bear working here that helps us with the type of research he is able to do. So here is Joe Spann.
Thank you, George, and hello to everybody out here this morning. I'm going to start by answering a question from one of our customers. He wanted to know if perhaps the L model designation used by Gibson on their guitars had something to do with Lloyd Lohr, their acoustic engineer. And the answer to that is pretty clear. No, it could not possibly have been any connection. We know from documentation that Gibson was using the L model designation as early as 1904. And that predates Lloyd Lohr's association with the company by at least a dozen years. So while it would be tempting maybe to say that, to make that association, there's absolutely no evidence for it and lots against it. I guess a corollary question would be, well, what does L stand for? If you figure that out, please let me know, because even I don't know the designations like A and F and L and J. I have no idea what the thought process was there. Certainly had nothing to do with Lloyd Lohr. Now, moving on, another question that we were supposed to answer today is, what exactly did Lloyd Lohr do at Gibson? What was his role? And I think after years of study that's a multifaceted answer. Lohr, prior to being associated with Gibson as an employee, had been a member of the Gibsonians from about the mid-teens, about 1915, 1916. He had worked sporadically with the Gibsonians, touring and promoting Gibson instruments. So his association went back at least that far. During World War I, he joined the Red Cross and was shipped to France just as the war ended. He was going to be an entertainer in France with the Red Cross and never got to fulfill that role because the war ended just as he got there. He did stay in France for a short period of time. He studied with musicians and composers there before returning to the United States. His formal association with Gibson as an employee started late in 1919 and probably had a lot to do with his good friend Lewis A. Williams, who was the general manager of Gibson at that time and also had been one of the founding members. Lou Williams, as he's commonly known, is the guy that's responsible for all that flowery prose that you read in the early Gibson catalogs. He was an early advocate of marketing, and I think what he saw in his friend Lloyd Lohr was an opportunity to use Lohr as a marketing tool. Now, that doesn't say much about what he thought about Lohr's abilities, does it? I think that he actually did believe that Lohr had great scientific ability and certainly appreciated Lohr's study of acoustics back at Oberlin College. Lohr was an alumni of Oberlin. I tend to think about Lohr as an acoustic engineer in the same way that I would think about the difference in a medical doctor. Was Lohr an acoustic engineer? Certainly. He had taken the courses that were available to him at the time and had certainly put a lot of thought process into even reaching beyond what was known. But the advent of electronic instruments to study acoustics and sound was still decades away when Lohr graduated from Oberlin. So Lohr was an acoustic engineer in the 1920s in the same way that we had a medical doctor in the 1920s. Things have moved on quite a bit since that point in time, and we would never say that a medical doctor today had only the abilities of someone from 1920. So I think of Lohr in that way. Yes, he was an acoustic engineer, but not in the way that we have acoustic engineers today. So Lou Williams brought him on board because of certainly his abilities and his thought process, but also I think really as a marketing tool. One of the things that we associate with Lohr, of course, is the labels, the signed labels, signed and dated labels inside the master model instruments. Did Lohr actually try each and every instrument that got a label? I don't think so. He signed many labels all on the same day. Too many labels to have tried and tested each and every one of those instruments, and then, as the label says, taken them apart and tuned them to work harmoniously. That, to me, no, I don't think that Lohr picked up each and every master model instrument and tested them himself. In fact, the entire idea of a signed label was lifted from Bacon mandolins. As early as 1921, one of Lohr's good friends and compatriots, William Place Jr., was signing labels for Bacon mandolins. They didn't call him an acoustic engineer. That was Lou Williams' idea, I'm sure. But William Place Jr. was signing labels inside Bacon mandolins as early as 1921. And I'm sure that Lou Williams, being the marketing guy that he was, he saw that and picked up on it. And certainly violins had had signed labels in them for many, many hundreds of years. I'm not exactly sure what Lloyd's contributions were, his exact contributions. The entire Gibson mandolin idea had been based on violin principles from the beginning. The idea of a slimmer profile, a carved top and back, all of those things were violin ideas that they brought from the very beginning to the Gibson mandolin. So what did Lohr bring? I'm not quite sure. And here's an example. Certainly, the master model instruments are different in that they have F-holes, like a violin, instead of an oval sound hole. They are different in that the neck position has been changed so that the bridge centers in the middle of the soundboard. Many people think that perhaps the scale length was changed on an F5 mandolin, and that is not true. If you measure an F4 and compare it against an F5, it's the same scale length. It's the neck that has been moved to place the bridge in the center of the soundboard, right between the F-holes, which is exactly like a violin construction. Was that Lohr's idea? I don't know. And here's an argument against. At the same time Lohr joined the company, a man by the name of Adrian Glarham Sr. joined the company. Adrian came to Gibson from down in Elkhart, Indiana, where he had worked for many years in a violin manufacturing company. And so the skill set that Adrian brought with him was considerable. He already knew about carving tops and backs. He knew about tone bars. He knew about F-holes. And so many of the things that we would attribute to Lohr, Adrian Glarham knew about that also, to the point that in the early 1940s, when Gibson was producing violins, Adrian Glarham Sr. was actually carving some of the tops in the high-end violins that Gibson offered and tap tuning them and putting tone bar bracing in them. So was that Lohr's idea, or was it something that Adrian Glarham brought to the table? It's difficult to say at this point. We really don't know. We know that Lohr was a proponent of the Viersey Brothers tone producer. That was certainly his contribution. He brought that. Lohr himself played the cello. And so he knew the Viersey brothers in New York City, and he thought their tone producer absolutely was useful in producing a more complex tone. So he definitely brought that. But as far as the other refinements of the Gibson mandolin system, I've never seen anything, any documentation that says Lloyd did this. He did this specifically. I haven't seen that. And even in later years, I've not seen anything. One of the questions that I get asked a lot is, why did Lloyd leave Gibson? And I think that's a kind of a multi-part answer too. Again, you'll remember that he started there because his good friend Lou Williams worked there and was the general manager. Well, Lou Williams got fired in September of 1923. He had overextended the company finances and had invested a lot of money in building master model instruments in a time when the mandolin was really no longer popular. And the board of directors was not happy with Lewis Williams. So they fired him in September of 23. They brought in to replace him a man named Guy Ferris, who was also an Oberlin graduate and probably a friend of Lloyd's because they were about the same age. Ferris came in as from the dairy equipment manufacturing area, so he didn't know anything about musical instruments, but he did know about modern production, and he brought that to Gibson, and he helped turn them around financially in just a year before he got himself fired. So in the course of a year, Lloyd had lost his friend Lou Williams, he'd lost his alumni member Guy Ferris, and probably just wasn't too much fun anymore. He said many times in later years that he did not enjoy the commercial production atmosphere of a factory, and he was more at home as an experimenter. So I'm going to kind of wrap it up by saying this. What was Lloyd's legacy? How did he see his legacy at Gibson? And I may give you a kind of a surprising answer. I don't think he thought much of it. His obituary in the Chicago Tribune doesn't mention his time at Gibson at all. A more detailed obituary that appeared in the Fretted Instrument News in the same year does mention his time at Gibson, but doesn't mention the master model instruments. I don't think Lloyd let his time at Gibson define him as a person, as an inventor, as a scientist. I think he probably looked back on it as just a blip on the radar. So I hope you've enjoyed it, and we're going to let George come back right now and talk to you some more about questions he has to answer. See you later.
Well, I'm back, and we'll plow into questions from our listeners. But Frank Ozimo, I have a 1979 Silverburst Les Paul Custom. I bought it used from Rudy's in New York in 1980. I recently found new condition old 79 stock T-top pickups and had them installed since the original pickups were not in the guitar. Rudy told me there are only 274 of these guitars made in 79. Can you give me any background on the Silverburst color if only 274 were produced, and what is the value of these guitars? Well, at this time, we don't have access to records to show us how many were made at that time. Gibson moved from Kalamazoo, closed at the factory, and consolidated in Nashville. The Nashville factory had opened in 74, but the Kalamazoo factory didn't close till 84, and the records were still up there, but they don't seem to have made it to Nashville. So right now, can the folks at Gibson look it up and tell you how many were made in that year in 79? No. Did Rudy have access to records in 1980 to tell him how many of these things were made in 79? Well, I don't know, but I know that we don't have access to records now to answer that question. And we have been over at Gibson, Joe, in his research, has spent quite a bit of time looking at some of the Gibson records, and they don't appear to be able to answer this question at Gibson. The Silverburst Finish was not in the catalog very long. It was not particularly popular at the time. But in fact, it used to be I'd get less money for a Silverburst than I would for a standard black or a Sunburst, but standard Sunburst. But these days, Silverburst has some cachet to it. We don't do appraisals as part of our weekly presentation, but we do have an online appraisal service which you can access by clicking on the appraisal button on the home page of our website. Bruce has a question: when purchasing a used or new guitar, what precautions should we take? Also, how do you check for fret wear and trueness of the neck? Well, if you really can't see fret wear, that should be pretty obvious. It either does or does not have visible wear. If the frets look clean and they are properly curved without depressions in them, without obvious wear, then that should be good. So far as trueness of neck, a absolutely straight neck is likely going to buzz. It usually should have a little bit of relief, usually more on an acoustic than on an electric, but it should not have a very obvious warp that you sight down the neck, warps and twists. And we also always check the truss rod to see if it works if we're buying a vintage or used instrument. But there's limits to what I can cover on that. If you don't know how to do it yourself, take a friend with you, or if you're buying a used one, take it. If you have an approval period, take it to a repair shop where they check it out and make sure everything is right. Jeffrey Bull asks, has anyone ever tried to use a sound post in an acoustic guitar like they are used in violins? My understanding is that it is used in a violin to counter the downward pressure of the strings. Well, that's not why there's a sound post in a violin. Violins have a bass bar, and they do not have a treble bar. They have a sound post that has to be positioned where it is slightly behind the treble foot of the bridge, and it transfers vibration of the top to the back. And it greatly alters the sound of the instrument depending on positioning of the sound post, pressure of the sound post. It has to be properly fitted with the right tension in the right spot. And without the sound post, the violin really doesn't sound the same at all and doesn't have anywhere near the power. A sound post on a plucked instrument does not function well. Archtop guitars are not built with sound posts, and experiments to put one in reduce sound, don't enhance sound, but removing a sound post on a violin is a whole different thing, but it's not there simply to counter the pressure of the strings. If you wanted to do that, you could put a bass bar and a treble bar, and it would do that just fine. And for example, on archtop guitars, they typically have a bass bar and a treble bar, or they may be X-braced, which can also do that to reinforce both sides. But also, you could, on an archtop instrument, simply build the top thicker and not need bracing at all, except it wouldn't sound the same. The bass bar and treble bar serve a purpose. Now, there are some violins and some even less expensive archtop guitars that have the top carved and the bass bar is just carved as part of the top. That doesn't work near as well either, because the bass bar and tone bars in a guitar can be with a slight curve to them, so that when they are glued in, it actually puts the top or the back under a slight pressure. The flat top guitars have the flat top and flat back on a flat top guitar isn't really flat. It has a slight arch. And if it doesn't have a slight arch, then with contraction and expansion due to changes in humidity, it's likely to crack. But also it changes the sound. And in a violin, the bass bar is actually causing the top to be flexed slightly, clamped when it's clamped in place and glued, and that does alter sound. But that's why there's a bass bar in a violin. John Chamberlain says, you have mentioned that playing a new guitar loudly will open it up. Can you please explain what opening up means and what actually happens to the wood in a new guitar when you break it in with aggressive strumming? Well, new instruments typically sound a bit stiff and it takes a while for them to open up, but it can be done quite swiftly. A really good instrument will sound good the day it's strung up, but they improve a bit, quite a bit with playing. And this is something that can happen quite swiftly if you play it hard and really vibrate it. And if you just barely tickle the strings, it doesn't open up much, but it can be dramatic enough on some instruments that are modern that I've taken them to a bluegrass jam session, and you can tell within the minute that it opened up. You play it for a couple of hours and all of a sudden it's like you shifted into an overdrive. And after that, it will also respond very nicely and be more responsive, played soft or medium, that you don't have to continue to banging on it. But bluegrass bands play loud when they're playing acoustic in a jam session with no microphones. And if you're playing a guitar or a mandolin in a group with guitar, banjo, mandolin, fiddle, and bass, banjo, or dobro, also, if you don't play loud, you won't be heard, but it'll open up quick. What actually happened structurally to the wood is not anything that you can really look at and see, but it does vibrate better. Things seem to just loosen up just enough that it makes a considerable difference in sound, enough so that not only can the player tell, but backstage at the Opry and sometimes in the middle of a jam session, if I've taken a new instrument there and they're trying it out, somebody from the other end of the room will say, what happened? All of a sudden, it sounds better. And they can hear it even from 10 feet away that it's different. TC Furlong, what is your opinion of high-end replica guitars such as 59 Les Paul Sunburst Replica? I recently acquired one in a trade. It's easily as good or better than any Les Paul I've played, including 3 real 59 Les Pauls, 2 of which were Gruhn guitars. I'm curious how one would go about determining the value on a replica. By the way, the body and neck on mine 60-year-old are 60-year-old one-piece mahogany, Honduras mahogany. Fretboard is Brazilian rose, when the top is Eastern flame maple, much like you'd find in a golden ear instrument. Well, first, I would say that, and I've said it many times before, new instruments today are better than what Gibson, Fender, or Martin made 50 years ago. Are they better than the golden era ones? In my opinion, no. While you may be very happy with the new one, and especially if you're playing it with a 1.5 long cord that goes to a wireless transmitter on your belt, and you got stomp boxes on the floor or rack-mounted digital effects, and that goes into a small amp which has a microphone in front of it, and that goes to a mixing board which goes into a power amp, which then goes into a house PA. Does it make a difference? By that point, no. But if you have just a cord attached to your guitar, which goes to a good tube amp of real quality, does it make a difference? Then, yeah, I think it does. And I can say that people like Billy Gibbons, Slash, Joe Bonamassa, Vince Gill, they hear a difference, and I trust their ears too. But if your ears don't hear a difference, get what you like. It's going to be a whole lot cheaper to get the new one, and the new ones are good, especially if you're on stage playing in a big auditorium using the type rig I just claimed that many of them use. Could I tell the difference sitting in the audience between a 59 real one and a new reissue? Even if I'm 10 feet away, the reissue, especially if it's relic, looks like a real one, sure enough, from 10 feet away? And does it sound perfectly fine through a modern rig with rack-mounted effects or stomp boxes and all that going on between the guitar and the player's ear? The answer is that new one will do just fine. It won't have the collectability. And through a very simple rig, I think the fact is some of the right old ones in the hands of the right artist. I'll trust guys like Joe Bonamassa to tell me which one he hears a difference on, because he says that there's a big difference. I'm more of an acoustic player myself, and I can tell you that I have acoustic guitars that I've never heard a new one duplicate the sound of. The Lloyd signed L5 guitar I showed on last week's session is one that I'm mighty happy to play, and I've never played any new guitar that sounds quite like it, but I've had new guitars that sound quite marvelous, and that are good enough for anybody to use on stage. So the quality of new guitars today is remarkably good. They're absolutely stage worthy. And on some instruments, it takes a master player to even hear the difference or to make the difference. For example, Brian Sutton can pick up a guitar, or Vince Gill can too, and get tones on it that I can't duplicate. I can pick up the same guitar, and I can play and get pretty damn good tone. But there are some tones that I hear Brian Sutton do that I can't do. And the same I can say for Vince. In the hands of a real master player, there are tones, electrically and acoustically, that most players can't duplicate. But the new guitars still are absolutely stage-worthy, good instruments. John Parsons of Richmond, Virginia, what do you think of Martin Monell strings? Are they the closest type strings to those used in the 30s? Do you prefer phosphor bronze or 80-20 for golden age acoustics? Well, one, those Monsteel strings that Martin has are very good. Martin strings in general are very good, but they're not the only company that makes good strings. And I can also tell you that on an extremely good guitar, it still works out well to see which strings make that guitar happy. I've had guitars that sound really good with DR strings and don't sound as good with Martin strings or with the Dario, Martin, DRs, etc. Some strings sound good on one and not on another. But in general, Darko or the Dario strings are very good, but they don't sound perfect on every guitar. Some guitars truly sound better with Martin brand strings. Some guitars sound great with Monell and not so great with bronze. Phosphor bronze versus 80-20, it depends on the guitar, and it's worth experimenting. And also some guitars sound best with light, and some really need mediums to drive them. And if you put, there are some guitars that really sound way better with light gauge. It's not just a matter of ease of playing. Different instruments respond differently, and even sometimes the same model guitar responds different to two guitars may respond differently to different type strings, and it is worth experimenting a bit. We have a set of interesting questions from a fellow named Calvin Hewer. He says, I inherited an original 1964 L series Fiesta Red Stratocaster, mint condition in every regard, original hang tags, case, polished cloth, strings, etc. I also have the original receipt from my dad who purchased the guitar in South Africa. We also have an original photo of my dad with this guitar. My dad was a huge Shadows, Hank Marvin fan, and so am I. This is a beautiful color. And his questions. First, is what are your thoughts on the most likely appreciation of its value 10, 25, 50 years from now? And darned if I know. I can't tell you what things are going to be worth 25 years from now. I'll be 75 years old August 21st. And so 25 years from now, I may or may not be here, but I'd certainly be old because 20 years from now, yeah, 75 plus 20, there'd be 95. 25, I don't know what guitars are going to be worth if and when I get to be 100 years old. I haven't had the greatest track record always knowing what they're going to be worth. Hindsight is great. And even though I have a 10-inch diameter crystal ball on my desk, when I look at it, about all it tells me is the world's upside down. Everything that flips the image. I can't tell you what they're going to be worth. I can at least tell you that it should be worth a lot of money, but I don't know what the quality of new guitars will be in that many years. But his next question is one that I think is really worthy of some consideration. I'm contemplating starting to play it and enjoy it more, but to be honest, I'm scared to put a scratch on it because of its value. I had a bird's eye, beautiful maple cabinet made for it, so at least I can enjoy it visually every day. It's also a shame not to play such an immensely beautiful instrument, both visually and sonically. What's your thoughts on this? How do you make the transition from a collector's piece to playing it? Are the pickups and electronics affected negatively by not playing it? And if so, do you recommend playing it to keep the pickup magnets healthy? I'm really struggling with this. Okay, one, playing it is not going to hurt the pickups. But if you have something that is absolutely pristine, the moment you put a scratch in it, its value is going to go down, possibly by thousands of dollars. And if you play it the way a lot of players do, you get belt buckle wear, fret wear, and really beat it up, you really shouldn't play it. If you're concerned about value, there's not very many left that are in this condition. And this is a museum piece. You'd be better off to keep it in the cabinet and not play it, except maybe once in a while, play a tune on it. But if you just use it as a utility tool, you know, you could buy something for a third the price, or maybe even a quarter the price, that was refinished or even reworked a bit. You know, just like Gilmour's Stratocaster that sold for $4 million plus, Pink Floyd guitar at auction. And that guitar was highly modified and beat, but if you take a pristine original one, and you're not as famous as Gilmour, that guitar is going to go down drastically in value, and you're effectively destroying a great collectible and a piece of art and history. When you have something that is historically that significant, in many ways, I would have to say that the best thing to do is don't play it, because you will enormously devalue it, and you could get something that you could enjoy playing that already has wear and scratches, and you wouldn't have to worry about that. If you add an extra scratch, the value will be exactly the same. And the playability will be every bit as good. As soon as you wear out the frets, don't do that. In fact, his next question, he says, the frets are small and low. I understand this is how they were in 1964. No wear on the existing frets, as it was hardly played by my dad. I'm going to play this guitar. If I'm going to play this guitar, enjoy it, would you recommend a refret with larger fret wire? Ooh, no, don't do that. If you have a guitar that has wear and the frets are worn and pitted, and you can't get that out with a fret dresser, it's been dressed a number of times, by all means, yes, let somebody who knows how refret it. But don't take a pristine guitar like this that is worth double, triple, or more than one that's used and modify it to do what you want. Take one that already has wear. But when you have an absolute museum piece that somebody would pay triple or more than what you would have to pay to get one that sounds and plays every bit as well and you could use without worrying about it. You find that most of the very finest musicians don't take one out on the road that is absolutely pristine. They'd prefer to take one out that has wear and that they don't have to worry that a scratch will cut its value in half. So you have something that is highly collectible and wonderful to have, but actually it's a liability to play. And the world has very, very few of those left. And if you beat it up, that's one less. And if that happens soon enough, there'll be none left if everybody does that. And I think the world is better off for having some that are museum grade. He also goes on, another very valid question that is a question that many people have asked, so it's not just answering only his question. I don't think I personally would ever sell the guitar. It's far too sentimental to me. However, once I pass this guitar on to my sons, should the family wish to try to sell it in the future, what would your advice be to find a buyer? Do you recommend selling privately, auction, approaching a specialist vintage dealer like yourself? If we were to sell it, I guess we would hope to go to a museum, or professional musician who would like it as it should be used. Use it as it should be. Well, I think use it as it should be would be its display if it's this clean. But there are different options as to how one can sell it. But for the average private owner who doesn't have a lot of connections, their choices are likely to be sell it outright to a dealer, consign it to a dealer, put it up for auction, or list it with one of the numerous online platforms that permits people to offer guitars for sale. So what do we have here? Well, with an auction company, most of them charge a 25% buyer's premium to the bidder. That means that whatever they bid is the winning bid, is have 25% end on top of that, and they say, well, you're not paying that. The buyer's paying that. No, the buyer's bidding 25% less than he was willing to pay because he knows his buyer's premium. Our commission to sell one is considerably less, especially since the auction houses usually add about 15% commission to the owner. So if you have 15% to the owner and 25% buyer's premium, they're really making 40%. Our commission is way less. Then the other option is online platforms. And there are obviously a number of those that I don't have to name, but I think most people listening to this are well aware. Their commission is a bit less than our commission, but typically they're almost like a reverse auction. The best known one, if you put your guitar up for sale with them, they have a make offer box. Well, that means whatever you're asking, somebody's going to offer less. But what seems to sell that way is if there's a bunch of guitars that might be somewhat similar to yours, then if you have the only one, you have a good chance that somebody may pay your price. But if there's multiples of this model, it's something that's not quite as rare, then they're going to either buy the cleanest possible one, but also at the best price. So if yours isn't the cheapest one or the only one, if you're in the middle, you're likely to have it sit there for a long time. And if you look at some of those sites, some of those things have been there for a long time. Plus, they don't do added value to your guitar. Now, if you have a guitar that is 50 years old or more, it very likely needs work to be set up in good playing order. And sometimes that might be as much as $1,000 of work to put it in good playing order, except if you sell it as is, it's like having a used car. If your car needs $500 or $1,000 worth of work to make it drivable, if you sell it as is, you might get $5,000 less. But if you do the work, you might get $5,000 more. And a lot of these instruments need work that requires very considerable skill. But when we take in a consignment, we do the work that's needed and then deduct that bill from the selling price afterward. But we don't do, say, $1,000 work to make it worth $1,000 more. We add value. And that is a service that the online platforms don't offer. And it is also a service that a shop that doesn't have a highly skilled repair service can't offer also. We have 6,000 square feet of repair shop and 8 people upstairs working there. And they can take jobs that most other shops could not do. And I like to think sometimes it's a little bit like the girl who her daddy claimed that she could weave straw into gold, and then the prince put her in the room with the straw-filled room and said if she could put it into gold overnight, that he'd marry her, and if she couldn't, he'd have her head chopped off. Well, she needed Rumpelstiltskin to do the job for her. Well, my guys upstairs can be almost like Rumpelstiltskin. We can take some things that seem almost impossible to fix, and we add value. So that's multiple questions, each one of which I think was surprisingly good. And he does have one more question that many other people have asked, so I'll go into that one as well. How does one go about obtaining a passport to travel with this instrument? I understand it has Brazilian rosewood and could be confiscated at customs. He's currently in Middle East in Qatar. Well, there is an issue traveling or shipping instruments overseas that have Brazilian rosewood or ivory. CITES, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. This requires permits, and the permits are good for only one way. So if you send it to somebody from Qatar coming into the USA, if it's inspected by customs and they suspect there's Brazilian rosewood on it, and you don't have a permit for it, even if that Brazilian rosewood was harvested 100 years ago, you have to be able to have a permit stating that it was harvested before June 11th of 1992. But if it was in fact harvested then, but you don't have a permit with it, they'll still be able to confiscate it because you sent it without proper paperwork. And this can and does happen. It may not get caught every time, but it's a big risk. And traveling musicians have had problems with ivory. Classical musicians with a bow that has ivory tip, or tortoiseshell frog, the adjustment part on the bow. Some of them are made with ebony, most with ebony, but some actually had tortoiseshell. And tortoiseshell is illegal also under the CITES Treaty. And without a permit, you can get in big trouble for that. In fact, it's hard to get a permit for tortoiseshell at all. But the point is, yes, you can get a permit, but you may spend a few $100s doing it. There are such things as a musical instrument passport, but how it's honored and where tends to be erratic. It's troublesome. My advice from those traveling musicians, if you're going overseas on tour, don't take an instrument with ivory or Brazilian rosewood. Take something with Indian rosewood or any rosewood but Brazilian, but don't take Brazilian rosewood. Within the USA, fine. Within the EU, you can go within it. But if you start crossing the customs boundaries without the permit, it is problematic. And if you get a permit to ship it, it's only good for one way. And then if you send it for repair, you gotta have a permit to get it in, then we have to have a permit to send it back. You're better off to have somebody work on it who's within your customs jurisdiction. And a last question, how do you insure vintage instruments? Generally, not through most homeowner insurance. They will want an appraisal regardless, but there are companies such as Heritage Insurance, it's out of Philadelphia area. That's the one that my own shop is insured with, and they specialize in nothing but musical instrument and music dealer insurance. But they started out doing classical instruments, violins. It could be $1 million or more. And if you have a good appraisal, people like that will handle it. But they are not alone. There are a number of companies that specialize in this. And most other homeowner policies really don't do a great job on musical instrument coverage. And if you ever have a loss, you're likely to end up with a lawsuit rather than a check. So be careful who you insure with. Insure with somebody who really does know musical instruments and specializes in that. And there are several, but Heritage is the one that we use ourselves. We have some new questions that just came in. Richard Buse, true or false? I once heard that back in 1970, and then 21-year-old Hank Williams Jr. was one of your friends that encouraged you to open Gruhn guitars. Well, I had actually talked a bit about that before, and the answer to his question is yes. But I met Hank in 1968, and he came and visited me in Knoxville, came over, he heard about me, he called and told him a little bit of what I had. He said, I could be there in 4 hours, and that was before the interstate highway system. It was amazing. He showed up, his Jaguar E showed up in 4 hours, and he didn't even have a British trained mechanic to fix it in case it broke down, which Jaguars at that time weren't too good. But then he came back the next day in a bigger car, bought more, and said that if I ever decided I wanted to come to Nashville, that he'd have an apartment waiting for me and he'd help me get started. And the fact is, I did decide some months later that I was getting tired of the academic scene, that having a degree in reptile behavior was probably not going to support me well. And I came to Nashville, and Hank did have an apartment waiting for me. And after a few months, we figured out that we weren't going to be the best of business partners, and we'd be good friends if we didn't become business partners. Sometimes the best way to lose friends is to go into business with them, or either loan them money or borrow money from them. So don't do that sometimes. Even in families, that can end up as feuds. Occasionally it works just great, but be awfully careful getting into partnership. But the fact is, yeah, I'm still on very good terms with Hank. And back in 1970, I used to go over to his house at least 3 times a week. And yes, he is responsible for getting me to move to Nashville. Jimmy K in Detroit, I'm curious as to why the World War II Gibson acoustic guitars, if as I understand, were built by untrained labor with available leftover materials, are desirable. Is it just limited number, or do they have a special sound? Well, I think that it's a bit of a misconception about what happened in the world during World War II. There were a bunch of women who were working at the factory who might not have been doing guitars before, but for the most part, they were doing relatively simple tasks, and a lot of them were doing things like string winding that you could teach somebody to do in a day. Most of the labor for the real construction work was still being done on the assembly line by men who'd been there a long time, and there were plenty of Gibson employees who were old enough that they were not eligible for the draft. And they still were able to make guitars, but they did have great problems getting enough materials. Production was definitely down, but there were guitars made during World War II at Gibson by people who still did know how to make guitars. And certainly the supervisors, sure enough, knew how to make guitars. And even today, Gibson, Martin, Fender, on the assembly lines, the people who are working those lines are not necessarily skilled luthiers who, given hand tools and wood, could do a guitar by themselves and have it ready by next week or next month, or maybe not even by next year. But they can do their own job very well. But otherwise, it would be like the comment I made previously about the little girl in the room with the straw. They need Rumpelstiltskin to help them. But the fact that you can't build a guitar from scratch with raw materials and hand tools, you may not be able to do that, but you may be able to do your job on the assembly line extremely well. And if you have supervisors who know each and every step along the way, you can end up with a really great guitar. And Martin today, Gibson, Taylor, many of these other makers, but certainly the major factories, Martin, Fender, Gibson, Taylor, most of their assembly line workers would not be able to make a guitar themselves from scratch with raw materials and hand tools. But that does not mean that the factory-made guitar isn't good, because all of those companies can make some very fine guitars. They did in the past with labor that was not necessarily able to make a guitar, each one of those people. They'd still have some people in research and development who knew how to make one from scratch, for sure. But the assembly line workers who built those guitars were not luthiers. In fact, the company management didn't want to hire skilled luthiers for those positions, because skilled luthiers have what I would call temperamental artist syndrome. They don't want to do what they're told all the time. They don't like to work on a 9-to-5 schedule and punch a time clock. They're temperamental artists, but they may do great work. But they're better for design prototypes rather than production line work, doing one job over and over and over and over again, like binding or spraying or shaping braces or working a machine. But that doesn't mean that these factory workers aren't good or that the quality isn't good. Thomas Sweeney, I wonder if George could talk about ukuleles. They're currently enjoying a kind of wave of popularity across a wide demographic spectrum. First big wave being in the teens and 20s when Martin produced thousands, the second in the 50s, and think of other instruments that come and go in favor like ukes. Well, yes, there are instruments that come and go in the fretted instrument market. In fact, some of the ones that today bring a lot of money came and went and then came back too. For example, let's look at mandolins. The mandolin orchestras really started when there was a group called the Spanish Students came and they toured and they played Spanish music, but it actually wasn't even on mandolins. It was on banderillas, which have more strings than a mandolin and a wider neck and look sort of more like a little mini guitar. But that was, for reasons that are almost inexplicable, that ended up with a mandolin craze, because the mandolin actually is easier to play. Mandolin is tuned just like a violin. And by the 1890s, at least by the late 90s, mandolin orchestras started developing. And there were a few makers, such as Joseph Bowman in Chicago and Orville Gibson, who started making mandolins and then mandolas tuned like a viola, and mandocello tuned like a cello, and even mando bass tuned like a bass. Now, in the Italian instruments from the old country, they had mandolins. They also had piccolo mandolins tuned higher and really tiny. And they had octave mandolins that were bigger, but not tuned exactly like a cello or like a mandola, like a viola, but instead tuned an octave below a mandolin. But Gibson came up, and Bowman too, at about the same time, came up with the concept of doing mandola like a viola and mandocello tuned like a cello. And that was in the very early 1900s and even going into the late 1890s that this idea came up that you could do mandolas and mandocellos. And actually Bowman was one of the first to do that. They were tuned just like members of a string quartet or a string orchestra. And that movement remained very popular up until the early 1920s. And the Lloyd Lore signed F5 mandolin that came in 22 and was discontinued December of 24, end of 24. Most through 24 December, there's a fair number still that were signed by Lore in 24. Lore signed labels in 22, 23, and 24, and they were signed in batches. So certain signature dates, there'd be a bunch of signatures on the same day. They weren't all, it's not like he signed all the labels in one day for the whole run. There were several signature dates. But at any rate, mandolin orchestras died dead as a doornail by the end of 21. You don't see very many from 22 onward. And the F5 mandolin was a commercial flop, but then bluegrass came along in 1945 and mandolins came back. And today mandolin is quite popular, but there was this intervening long period from 1922 through 1945 that hardly anybody wanted a mandolin, and mandolin sales plummeted. Ukuleles were very popular when there was a World's Fair, that the Hawaiians had a pavilion, and ukulele music was the rage in the teens and in the 20s and right on into the 30s, and then it almost vanished. But after World War II, Arthur Godfrey in the 50s played ukulele, and he repopularized uke. And that went on through much of the 50s, but fizzled out in the 60s. But more recently, it's folks like Jake Shimbamakuro who played tenor uke rather than soprano uke. By the way, Arthur Godfrey played mostly baritone uke, which didn't even exist much before him. But rather than soprano uke, today, most of the uke players who are really, really into it seem to be using tenor ukes. And that's a big movement, and that may last a long time because players like Shimbamakuro can do some pretty amazing things on it. But that's an example. Ukes have phases they went through. Mandolins did. Archtop acoustic guitars were popularized for the F-hole archtops from the early 1930s through the 40s. First with the crooners, when Dixieland came, tenor banjos were popular. But tenor banjo was popular with the Dixieland era, basically from about 1921 through up to about 1930, 29 or 30. And then tenor banjo sales just plummeted. But five-string banjo became popular with bluegrass, but originally banjos were more from the 1840s right on up through about 1905. Five-string banjo was the popular banjo, and it evolved from fretless to fretted, open back to with resonator. But most of that period of 1840s through 1905, that was all open back, and then tenor band, for a while, just banjo bands just disappeared. There were complete banjo orchestras that had piccolo banjos and banjarines and different tunings, alto banjos and even a bass banjo, all with five strings. But that fizzled out in the early 1900s. And then banjo in general fizzled out. But mandolin orchestras then came in, and that fizzled out in the early 20s. Then tenor banjo came back, and then five-string banjo came back big time with bluegrass. So many instruments have their phases of popularity. But today, I think Martin flat tops, they've been around a heck of a long time, and Martin, Gibson, Fender, and these other companies right now have models that I think are going to be quite enduring. Do I think that the six-string flat top guitar is a fad at this point? No, it's very, very, very versatile. Tenor banjo seems to be less versatile and really hasn't transitioned much from Dixieland to other forms of music. But the fact is that instruments that are versatile enough to be used for a wide variety of different types of music, which often are completely different than the designers ever had in mind, those are the ones that endure. Gibson mandolins were very versatile, such that they can be used for jazz, they can be used for classical, they can be used for pop. They can be, they are incredibly versatile. 6-string flat top guitars are incredibly versatile, and they're like a mini orchestra that you can play unaccompanied or in a small ensemble or in a big group. An electric guitar also is an extremely versatile instrument. Leo Fender didn't ever envision sounds like Jimi Hendrix or Roy Buchanan or numerous other players today, Eric Johnson, Vince Gill, Eric Clapton. They don't sound like anything Leo envisioned, but the guitar is versatile enough to do that, just like the electric bass. I think it's here for a heck of a long time. You can play all sorts of things. The more versatile an instrument is, the more it's likely to last. And we have some truly phenomenal design instruments now. And I've been in business with a store now for 50.5 years. And in spite of the coronavirus pandemic, we're still doing relatively well. We don't have quite as many people walking through the door because we limit it to 4 customers at a time in the showroom with face masks for everybody. But our online sales aren't limited to that. And even for the walk-ins, if they have to wait a few minutes to get in, they still get in if they want to come. But the point is, these instruments that we have today have stood the test of time. And there may be waves of popularity for different styles of music that may use different type instruments, but the ukulele is not going to go away anytime soon. It's gone through waves of popularity, and we can see some great musicians. Tenor and plectrum banjo, I'm somewhat less confident about how well they're going to come back. 5-string banjo is incredibly versatile. You can do a heck of a lot more than bluegrass on it. And electric and acoustic guitars are remarkably well evolved. They're great instruments. But is there room for further invention? Yes, there is. And back in the 1890s, the director of the US Patent Office said that he thought they might need to close it because everything that could be invented had been. And obviously, he was highly mistaken. I can't tell you with certainty what things will be worth in the future. I can't predict every musical trend that's going to come in the future. It's been a wild, interesting roller coaster ride while I've been in business. I've seen lots of ups and downs and trends and some fads, but there have been some things that have been rock solid stable. And that is the really fine golden age instruments made at their prime by the best makers have stood the test of time. They are versatile, but I would not want to imply that you have to have one of those to play good music. Some of the best music in the world has been done on some remarkably cheap instruments, especially if you look at blues. Some of the finest blues players ever composed their stuff and played it on very cheap instruments. And if you try to play funky old-time blues, which can be great music, if you play it on an extremely sophisticated, very mellow instrument, it may not even sound authentic, but there's a certain soul. Good instruments have soul and personality, and that's not always the same as being expensive. You don't have to be a snob about instruments to play good music, and instruments can have soul and personality. But I know when I'm listening for a guitar, I want to hear good balance of volume, string to string, and up and down the board. I want to hear good dynamic range, string to string, up and down, uniform response in that way. I want to hear good sustained balance, where if you hit a 6-note chord, it fades equally on all strings. Every string is capable of that. I want to hear good harmonic response. So the fundamental note is there, but also you have harmonics above and below it, and it gives a rich, full tone. And I want to hear good clarity of articulation all the way. And with that, I'll sign off. Feel free, if you have questions or if you disagree with me, please let me know, because I am happy to answer questions and correspond with you by email, george@guitars.com, or you can call the shop number here and I'll talk with you, because I can't answer everything, but I don't mind intellectual debate. And if you prove me wrong, I'm not going to get mad. I will have learned something new. I'm old enough that in order to learn something new, I might have to change a previously held opinion. I don't claim to be omniscient yet. When that happens, I'll let everybody know. Until that, see you next week.